"I'd do anything for one night with you," the mountain man whispered to the virgin fat girl. Snow howls outside a broken shack in the high Colorado mountains. Inside, a lonely frontiersman finds a trembling girl, cast out by her own kin and left to freeze. But his desperate whisper isn't lust, it's loneliness, hunger for warmth, a plea to God not to be alone again. He swears to protect her, but the frontier doesn't forgive so easily. A posse rides in, claiming she belongs to them. A preacher spreads lies, hiding sins darker than the winter night, and her own kin would rather see her ruined than free. She holds a Bible, he holds a rifle. Together they stand against a town ready to tear them apart. But when chains rattle, lies rise, and truth demands a voice, will love be strong enough to shatter shame? Or will the mountain swallow them both? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The biting Colorado wind howled through the mountain passes as Kevin Boone trudged through knee-deep snow toward the line shack. His boots crunched against the frozen ground, each step a battle against the growing darkness and bitter cold. The last rays of winter sunlight caught the ice crystals swirling in the air, turning them into tiny diamonds that stung his weathered face. His fingers, stiff inside his leather gloves, clutched the deed to the shack, purchased with his last silver dollar from a desperate rancher heading east. The paper felt thin and fragile, like the remnants of his dreams. 5 years of loneliness since his wife's passing had carved deep lines into his face, matching the scars on his calloused hands. Kevin reached the door, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. The wooden planks groaned as he pushed it open, sending a shower of snow cascading from the frame. His rifle, heavy after the long trek, remained steady in his grip as he crossed the threshold. The sight before him stopped him cold. A fire flickered weakly in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls, and huddled beside it, clutching a worn Bible to her chest, sat a young woman. Her eyes, wide with fear, met his, and for a moment, neither moved. She was plump, with soft features that spoke of youth. No more than 19 summers, Kevin reckoned. Her dress, though clean, showed signs of hard travel, and her shawl was pulled tight against the cold. Despite her obvious fear, there was something in her posture that spoke of dignity. "Who are you?" Kevin's voice came out rougher than he intended, scratchy from disuse. "Ruby Mayfield, sir." Her voice trembled slightly, but she lifted her chin. I had nowhere else to go." Kevin shut the door behind him, blocking the wind's icy fingers. The small space grew quieter, with only the pop and crackle of the dying fire between them. "This is my property now," he said, gesturing with the deed. "Just bought it today." Ruby's fingers tightened on her Bible. "My uncle, he sent me away." The words seemed to catch in her throat. "Said I was nothing but a burden. Too big, too slow, too—" She swallowed hard. "Too useless." The cruel words hung in the air like frost. Kevin felt something stir in his chest, a familiar ache of loneliness mixed with an unexpected surge of protective anger. He'd seen the way some folks treated those who didn't fit their narrow view of worth. The wind rattled the shutters, one hanging loose, he noticed, and Ruby shivered. The fire was little more than embers now, barely warming the small space. Kevin's eyes traveled from the young woman to his meager supplies, then back to her face, which held both fear and determination. The cold and isolation of countless nights pressed down on him, and before he could stop himself, the words slipped out in a desperate whisper. "I'd do anything for one night with you." Ruby's reaction was immediate. She pressed herself against the wall, clutching her Bible like a shield. "I would rather die than be dishonored," she whispered, her voice fierce despite its softness. "The Lord is my shelter and my strength." Shame flooded through Kevin, hot and heavy. He dropped to his knees, keeping his distance from her, his head bowed. "Miss Mayfield, I spoke wrongly. I give you my word as a man who once knew better days. I will not harm you." He set his rifle down, sliding it away from himself. "You have my protection, not my threat." The silence stretched between them, broken only by the wind's mournful song and the dying fire's last protests. Finally, Kevin stood slowly and moved to his pack. "I have some venison stew," he offered quietly. "It ain't much, but it's hot once warmed." Ruby watched him carefully as he pulled out his small pot and the wrapped meat. Her stomach growled audibly, and a blush colored her cheeks. I haven't eaten since yesterday morning, she admitted. Kevin worked in silence, banking the fire with fresh wood from his pack and setting the pot to heat. The familiar motions of camp cooking filled the awkward space between them. As the stew began to warm, rich aromas filled the small shack, making it feel almost like a home. He served her first, in his one tin cup, then took his portion in the pot itself. They ate without speaking, but the tension gradually eased as the warm food and fire did their work. Ruby's shoulders relaxed slightly, and some color returned to her cheeks. The broken shutter banged again, sending a draft through the room. Kevin set aside his empty pot and stood, moving to examine the damage. The hinges had come loose, but it was nothing he couldn't fix. He pulled tools from his pack and began working, the familiar rhythm of hammer and nail providing a counterpoint to the storm's fury. Ruby watched him work, her Bible now resting in her lap rather than clutched to her chest. The firelight caught the gold lettering on its worn cover, and her fingers traced the familiar words absently. "Thank you," she said softly, "for the food, and," she hesitated, "for your promise." Kevin paused in his work, looking at her over his shoulder. The fear in her eyes had been replaced by something closer to cautious trust. He nodded once, then turned back to the shutter. "Storm's getting worse," he said, testing the repair. "We'd both have frozen alone tonight. Reckon the good Lord had his reasons for putting us in the same place." The words surprised him as they left his mouth. He hadn't spoken of the Lord since Sarah died, hadn't wanted to, but something about Ruby's quiet faith stirred memories of better days, when prayer came easier and hope wasn't such a stranger. As he worked, Ruby began humming softly, a hymn he half remembered from long ago. The sweet notes mixed with the wind's howl and the fire's crack, creating a strange sort of peace in the little shack. Kevin finished with the shutter and added more wood to the fire, watching as the flames grew stronger, pushing back the darkness and cold. They settled into their separate corners for the night, the fire between them both a barrier and a bridge. Ruby wrapped herself in her shawl, her Bible still close at hand, but her posture was more relaxed now. Kevin sat with his back against the wall, his coat pulled tight, watching the shadows dance on the ceiling. The storm raged outside, but inside the line shack, something fragile was taking root. Not trust, not yet, but perhaps the beginning of understanding. Two strangers, brought together by desperation and cold, finding in each other's presence a small measure of the warmth they'd both been missing. As the night deepened, Ruby's breathing evened out into sleep, her face peaceful in the firelight. Kevin kept watch, his promise heavy on his heart, but not as heavy as the realization that for the first time in 5 years, he didn't feel completely alone. The wind continued to howl, and the snow piled higher outside the door, but the repaired shutter held firm, keeping the worst of the cold at bay. In the small space between sleeping and waking, Kevin found himself wondering if maybe, just maybe, there was still room in this harsh world for mercy, for honor, and for hope. The fire burned steady now, its warmth reaching out to touch Ruby's cheeks with a gentle glow, while Kevin sat in his vigil, the night stretching long before them both. The pale light of dawn crept through the repaired shutter, bringing with it the crisp scent of fresh snow. Ruby stirred beneath her shawl, awakened by an unfamiliar aroma that made her stomach growl. Coffee, real coffee, not the chicory blend she'd grown used to at her uncle's ranch. The rhythmic sound of an axe splitting wood echoed from outside. Steady and sure, she sat up slowly, her muscles stiff from sleeping on the wooden floor. The fire had been built up again, its warmth taking the worst edge off the morning chill. A battered coffee pot sat near the flames, steam rising from its spout. Ruby touched her Bible, still close at hand, drawing comfort from its familiar presence before rising to her feet. The door opened, letting in a blast of cold air along with Kevin Boone. His arms were laden with split wood, frost clinging to his beard. He nodded at her, setting the wood carefully by the hearth. "Morning," he said simply, brushing snow from his coat. "Coffee's nearly ready." Ruby smoothed her skirts, feeling awkward but determined to be useful. "I saw some cornmeal in your supplies last night," she offered. "I could fix some mush, if you'd like." Kevin paused in the act of reaching for the coffee pot, studying her face. After a moment, he nodded again. "Pot's there," he said, gesturing to his meager cookware. "Been a while since I had proper mush." Ruby set to work, Grateful for the familiar task, she stirred the cornmeal carefully, adding a pinch of salt from Kevin's supplies. The wooden spoon moved in smooth circles, just as her mother had taught her years ago. The simple routine calmed her nerves, helping her feel more settled in this strange situation. When the mush was done, thick and smooth, she ladled it into their makeshift bowls. Kevin had poured the coffee, and the rich scent filled the small space. He took a bite of the mush and his eyebrows rose slightly. "This is good," he said, genuine surprise in his voice. "Thank you." Those two simple words, "thank you," brought unexpected tears to Ruby's eyes. She blinked them back quickly, focusing on her own bowl. "You're welcome," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes before Kevin spoke again. "About your uncle," he said carefully. "What happened?" Ruby's spoon stilled. The weight of shame and hurt pressed down on her chest, but something in Kevin's steady gaze gave her courage. "Uncle Horace said I was taking up too much space, eating too much food." The words came out bitter and pained. "Said I was a burden no man would want, that he couldn't afford to keep feeding me when I'd never bring any value to his ranch." She swallowed hard. "He gave me an hour to pack my Bible and one change of clothes. Said if I wasn't gone by sundown, he'd have the hands drive me off." Kevin's hand tightened on his coffee cup and she saw a flicker of rage cross his weathered face before he got it under control. "That ain't right," he said quietly. "No kin should treat family that way." "I didn't know where else to go," Ruby admitted. "I walked until I couldn't anymore. Found this place just before dark yesterday." Kevin was silent for a long moment, considering. "Spring's coming in a few months," he said finally. "Mining camps'll be hiring then. They need cooks, laundresses, decent work, fair pay." He met her eyes. "You can stay here until then if you've a mind to. I gave my word last night you'll be safe." Relief flooded through Ruby, making her dizzy. "Thank you," she whispered. I'll earn my keep. I can cook, clean, mend. No earning needed." Kevin cut in firmly. "It's the right thing to do, is all." Ruby nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She busied herself with cleaning up their breakfast things, trying to process this unexpected kindness. As she worked, Kevin cleared his throat. "Fair warning. My cooking's liable to make you regret staying. Been living on trail food so long, I reckon I've forgotten what real victuals taste like." A small laugh escaped Ruby before she could stop it. The first time she'd laughed in weeks. The sound surprised them both. Kevin's mouth twitched in what might have been the ghost of a smile before he turned to bank the fire. Later that afternoon, with the sun high in a crystal-clear sky, Kevin took Ruby outside to show her how to set rabbit snares. The snow crunched beneath their boots as they made their way to a small copse of trees near the shack. Ruby watched, fascinated, as Kevin's large hands moved with surprising delicacy, demonstrating how to bend the wire just so. "See here," he explained, his breath frosting in the cold air. "Rabbit runs along this track, puts its head through the loop." His fingers worked the wire with practiced ease. Simple, but it works. Better than burning through ammunition. Ruby paid close attention, determined to learn. When Kevin handed her some wire to try, her first attempts were clumsy, but he showed patience she hadn't expected, adjusting her grip gently until she got it right. "There," he said with approval when she finally set a proper snare. "You're a quick study." The praise, simple as it was, warmed her more than the winter Sunday. They set a few more snares together, Kevin pointing out the signs of rabbit trails in the snow. The work was peaceful, requiring focus but not strain, and Ruby found herself relaxing despite the cold. As evening approached, they returned to the shack. The fire was built up again, and Kevin showed her how to clean and oil his spare rifle. "Just in case," he said gruffly. Ruby had never handled firearms before, but she listened carefully to his instructions about safety and care. The day's activities had created a kind of comfortable routine between them, a tentative trust born of shared work and respect. As darkness fell outside, Ruby felt safer than she had in months. The shack was still drafty, but it felt almost like a home now, with the fire crackling and the coffee pot bubbling gently. After their simple supper, Ruby knelt by her bedroll, Bible open in her hands. The familiar words of Psalms brought comfort as she prepared for evening prayers. Kevin sat quietly by the fire, respecting her devotions without comment. But just as she began to pray, the sound of approaching horses broke the peaceful silence. Hoofbeats crunched in the snow, growing louder, accompanied by the creak of saddle leather and the clink of metal. Lantern light flickered through the window, casting wild shadows on the walls. "Kevin Boone," a rough voice called out. "Open up, we need to talk." Ruby's heart began to pound as she looked at Kevin. His face had gone hard, all trace of the day's gentleness vanished. He moved to the door, motioning for her to stay back in the shadows. 4 men sat their horses outside, lanterns swaying in the darkness, their breath and their mounts creating clouds of steam in the cold night air. The light caught the glint of tin stars on 2 of their vests. Ruby pressed herself against the wall, clutching her Bible close, as Kevin's hand moved to rest near his holstered pistol. The peaceful evening had shattered like ice in spring, leaving only the sharp edges of fear behind. The scene hung suspended in that moment, Kevin standing rigid by the door, the posse waiting outside with their lanterns casting uncertain light, and Ruby holding her breath in the shadows, praying silently for protection. All the trust and safety they'd built through the day seemed suddenly fragile as spring ice, ready to crack beneath their feet. Kevin drew a slow breath and stepped out into the cold night air, his rifle held low but ready. The wooden boards of the porch creaked beneath his boots as he faced the 4 mounted men. Their horses shifted restlessly, steam rising from their flanks in the lamplight. Ruby pressed herself against the doorframe inside, her heart thundering. Through the gap, she could see the posse clearly now. Rough men with hard eyes, 2 wearing deputies' badges that caught the yellow glow of their lanterns. The leader, a lean man with a graying mustache, leaned forward in his saddle. "Evening, Boone. Name's Fletcher. I'm foreman at the Mayfield spread." His tone was deceptively casual, but his hand rested near his holstered revolver. "We're here about some stolen property." "Ain't no stolen property here," Kevin replied evenly, though Ruby could hear the tension in his voice. Fletcher's eyes narrowed. "That ain't so. Horace Mayfield's niece is here. She's under his legal guardianship. Girl ain't fit to care for herself, dependent-like. We're here to take her back where she belongs." Ruby's fingers dug into the wooden doorframe, her throat tight with fear and anger. The word property burned in her chest like poison. Kevin shifted his weight, adjusting his grip on the rifle. "Miss Mayfield came here of her own free will, after being driven out. She's a grown woman, free to choose where she stays. Now see here," Fletcher said, his friendly manner dropping away. "That girl's uncle has papers proving his guardianship. She ain't got the means or sense to make her own way. Best hand her over peaceful-like." "No." Kevin's voice was quiet but firm as iron. "She stays if she wants to stay." One of the deputies pushed his horse forward. "You ought to think careful about this, Boone. Man living alone with an unmarried woman ain't proper. Could lose your land rights over such impropriety." His hand moved, to rest on his revolver. Maybe worse. Ruby had to press her hand against her mouth to keep from crying out. The threat in those words was clear as winter stars. But Kevin didn't move. "I reckon that's my choice to make." His voice remained steady, though Ruby could see how tightly he gripped the rifle. "Now, unless you've got proper papers from a judge, I suggest you ride on." Fletcher's face hardened. "You're making a mistake, Boone. We'll be back with the law proper behind us. Then you'll have no choice but to give her up, and likely forfeit this land you've barely paid for. When you come back," Kevin said quietly, "bring a judge's order. Until then, get off my property." The tension stretched tight as a bowstring. Ruby hardly dared breathe as she watched the men's hands hover near their weapons. But after a long moment, Fletcher reined his horse around. "Your choice, Boone," he called over his shoulder. "But you'll regret it." The posse turned and rode away, their lantern light fading into the darkness like dying stars. Kevin stood watching until the sound of hoofbeats faded completely before coming back inside. His face was grim as he bolted the door. Ruby couldn't hold back her tears any longer. They spilled down her cheeks as she sank onto a wooden chair. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I've ruined everything for you. Your land, your safety, all because of me." Kevin set his rifle aside and knelt in front of her chair, his weathered face gentle. "Listen here," he said firmly. "This was my choice. Couldn't live with myself, turning you out to those men who'd treat you like property." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Your uncle's wrong about you. You've got strength in you, And dignity. Worth standing up for. Ruby wiped her eyes with trembling fingers. But they'll come back. With the law. Like they said. They'll take your land. Maybe. Kevin stood and added wood to the fire. But tonight, we're safe. Tomorrow's troubles can wait for tomorrow. The flames crackled higher, pushing back the darkness. Ruby clutched her Bible, drawing comfort from its familiar leather binding. Almost without thinking, she began to hum softly, an old hymn her mother had sung in times of trouble. Kevin looked over at her, surprise softening his features. After a moment, he moved his chair closer to hers by the fire. "Know that one," he said quietly. "Been years since I heard it, though." Ruby's voice grew stronger as she began to sing the words. "Be not dismayed, whate'er betide. God will take care of you." To her amazement, Kevin's deep voice joined in, rough and unpracticed but sincere. "Beneath his wings of love abide. God will take care of you." Their voices blended in the firelit cabin, her clear soprano and his rough bass creating something unexpectedly beautiful. The hymn filled the small space with its promise of protection, and Ruby felt some of her fear ease. The fire popped and sparked, casting warm light over them as they sang through all the verses Ruby could remember. When they finished, a peaceful silence settled over the cabin, despite the threat still waiting in the darkness outside. "Thank you," Ruby whispered, though whether she meant for the song or his protection, she wasn't sure. Kevin nodded, his eyes on the flames. "My wife used to sing that one," he said softly, then fell silent again. Ruby didn't press him for more, understanding the weight of grief in those few words. Instead, she opened her Bible and began to read by firelight, finding comfort in the familiar psalms. Kevin sat quietly beside her, his solid presence a shield against the night's uncertainties. The fire burned low, casting their shadows on the rough walls. Outside, the wind whispered through pine boughs, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called. But inside the cabin, they had found a moment of peace, fragile as it might be, built on shared song and silent understanding. Ruby glanced at Kevin's profile, seeing the firelight play across his strong features. He had risked everything to protect her. A stranger, simply because it was right. In that moment, she felt something shift in her heart, a spark of hope taking root despite all fear and doubt. The hymn's promise echoed in her mind as she returned to her reading. God will take care of you. She prayed it would prove true for both of them in the days to come. Dawn broke cold and clear over the line shack, painting the snow-covered ground in shades of rose and gold. Ruby stirred on her pallet, awakened by the familiar sounds of Kevin starting the morning fire. Her muscles ached from sleeping on the hard floor, but determination burned bright within her. "Let me help with the chores," she said, rising and straightening her wrinkled dress. "Please, I want to earn my keep." Kevin paused in stoking the fire, studying her face. "Works hard in this weather." "You sure?" "I'm stronger than I look," Ruby replied, lifting her chin. "And I won't be a burden." A ghost of a smile touched Kevin's lips. "Reckon we could start with water. Creek's half frozen, but we need it all the same." They bundled up against the biting cold, Kevin in his heavy coat, Ruby wrapping herself in an old blanket he offered. The creek lay a short distance from the shack, its banks crusted with ice. Kevin showed her how to break through the frozen surface with a heavy stick, then demonstrated filling the wooden buckets without getting soaked. Ruby's hands soon grew numb, and water sloshed over her boots, but she persisted. Together they made 3 trips, the buckets growing heavier with each return journey. By the last trip, her arms trembled, but pride warmed her chest. She hadn't complained once. "Need firewood next," Kevin said, leading her to a stand of pine trees. He showed her which fallen branches would burn best, teaching her to look for the dry wood under snow-covered boughs. Ruby gathered armload after armload, though pine needles pricked through her dress and sap stuck to her hands. "You're doing fine," Kevin said quietly when she stumbled. The simple praise made her stand straighter, determined to prove herself useful. As the morning wore on, Kevin pointed to the cabin's roof. "Got a bad patch up there, needs fixing. Canvas and tar'll hold till spring if we do it right." Ruby's heart sank at the thought of climbing onto the sloping roof, but she nodded firmly. "Show me how." Kevin demonstrated the repair process on the ground first, how to spread the canvas smooth and apply the thick tar evenly. Then he helped her climb up, his strong hands steady as she found her footing on the rough shingles. The work was messy and awkward. Ruby's fingers fumbled with the canvas in the cold, and tar smeared across her sleeves. Snow melted under her knees, soaking through her dress, but she refused to give up, even when her hands shook from the effort of holding the heavy tar bucket. Almost there, Kevin encouraged from below. Just need to secure that corner. By the time they finished, Ruby was covered in soot and snow, her face streaked with tar, but the patch was solid, and pride glowed warm in her chest at Kevin's approving nod. The short winter day was already fading when they finally went inside. Ruby's muscles ached, but satisfaction filled her as she helped Kevin prepare a simple supper of beans and salt pork. They ate in comfortable silence until Kevin cleared his throat. "Been 5 winters," he said softly, staring into his tin cup. "Since I lost Sarah." Ruby set down her spoon, hearing the weight of grief in his voice. "Fever took her," he continued, his words coming slow and painful. "Nothing the doctor could do. I was out trapping when it hit. By the time I got back," his voice caught, "always wondered if I could have saved her. If I'd been here." "Oh, Kevin." Ruby's eyes filled with tears at his pain. "It wasn't your fault." He shook his head. "Should have been here. Should have." He fell, silent, shoulders hunched against old guilt. Ruby reached across the rough table and touched his hand gently. "The Lord knows your heart," she said softly. "And Sarah would want you to forgive yourself." Kevin didn't respond, but he didn't pull away either. They sat in understanding silence as the fire crackled behind them. Finally, Ruby stood and went to the small pile of supplies. "We've got a bit of flour left," she said. "Let me make you some biscuits." "Don't need to waste it," Kevin protested. But Ruby was already measuring the flour into a bowl. "It's not waste to show kindness," she said firmly. She worked quickly, mixing the dough with practiced hands. Soon the cabin filled with the warm smell of baking bread. When she placed the golden brown biscuits before him, Kevin bowed his head for a long moment. When he looked up, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Been a while since anyone." He stopped, swallowing hard. "Much obliged." They cleaned up together afterward, washing the few dishes in comfortable silence. Ruby hummed softly as she worked, an old hymn her mother had taught her. "Feel safe here," she said suddenly, surprising herself with the admission. "First time since I was little, really. Since Mama died." Kevin paused in drying a plate. "Glad of that," he said gruffly, but his eyes were kind. A wolf howled in the distance, answered by another. Ruby jumped, then laughed at herself. "Suppose I shouldn't feel safe with wolves about." "They won't come near while the fire's lit," Kevin assured her. His mouth quirked in a rare smile. "Besides, reckon you're brave enough to face them after today's work." Ruby laughed again, the sound bright in the warm cabin. "I must look a sight, all covered in tar and soot." "Honest work leaves honest marks," Kevin said simply, but his words made her stand taller. As night settled fully outside, Ruby prepared for sleep, tucking her mother's Bible carefully beside her pallet. The familiar leather binding brought comfort as she knelt to pray. "Lord," she whispered, "thank you for this shelter, this safety." She paused, glancing at Kevin's broad back as he banked the fire. "And please help Kevin find peace, help his heart heal." She touched the Bible's worn cover. "And thank you for bringing us together in this place." The wolves called again in the darkness, but their voices seemed less threatening now. Ruby pulled her blanket close, feeling truly at peace for the first time in many long months. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now, she was warm, safe, and no longer alone. Kevin's quiet movements around the cabin were oddly comforting as she drifted toward sleep. His presence felt like a shield against the winter night, against all the fears and doubts that had haunted her since her uncle cast her out. The fire popped and settled, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Ruby's last conscious thought was a prayer of gratitude for this unexpected sanctuary, and for the quiet man who had opened his door to a stranger in need. The days settled into a gentle rhythm at the line shack. Each morning brought new tasks, but Ruby faced them with growing determination. Her hands, once soft from indoor work, grew stronger from hauling water and stacking firewood. The cold that had once seemed bitter now felt crisp and invigorating. Kevin showed her how to check the rabbit snares they had set, teaching her to read the subtle signs of animal movement in the snow. Ruby proved to be a quick study, her eyes sharp for detail. When she caught her first rabbit alone, her face glowed with pride. "Look, Kevin," she called, holding up her prize. "I did it just like you showed me." He nodded, approval warming his usually stern features. "Fine work. You're getting the hang of it." Together they developed an easy partnership in the daily chores. While Kevin repaired his trapping gear, Ruby kept the fire stoked and the cabin tidy. She discovered she had a talent for patching clothes, saving Kevin's worn wool shirts from complete ruin. Her neat stitches earned his quiet thanks, though she noticed he always changed in the lean-to outside, careful of her modesty. The physical work brought color to Ruby's cheeks and strength to her limbs. She no longer felt winded climbing the slope behind the cabin, and her appetite grew healthy and strong. Kevin never commented on her size, treating her instead with steady respect that helped her stand taller each day. When Sunday dawned clear and cold, Ruby took out her mother's Bible, its leather binding smooth from years of use. She hesitated, then spoke softly. Would you like to join me in prayer?" Kevin paused in his whittling, looking uncertain. "Been a spell since I prayed proper," he admitted. "But I reckon I could listen, if you're willing to lead." Ruby opened to the Psalms, the familiar words bringing comfort. "The Lord is my shepherd," she read, her voice growing stronger. "I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters." Kevin sat with his head bowed, hands clasped awkwardly in his lap. But as Ruby continued reading, his shoulders relaxed, and peace settled over his weathered face. When she finished, he remained quiet for a long moment before murmuring, "Amen." The morning's devotion seemed to lift both their spirits. After their simple dinner, Kevin suggested they haul in more firewood while the weather held fair. He had rigged a crude sled from planks and rope, perfect for bringing down loads from the wooded slope. "We can work together," he explained, showing Ruby how to stack the logs securely. "You guide from behind while I pull. Keep it straight on the slope." The work was hard but satisfying. Ruby threw herself into it, helping to load and steady the sled. On their third trip down, a hidden bump sent them both tumbling into a snowbank. Ruby emerged, sputtering, snow in her hair and down her collar. To her amazement, Kevin laughed. And Kevin laughed, a deep, rusty sound as if he had almost forgotten how. The sight of him covered in snow, his usual gravity forgotten, set Ruby to giggling. Soon they were both laughing freely, their joy echoing off the mountains. "Lord above," Ruby gasped, wiping tears from her eyes. "I haven't laughed like that since I was a girl." Kevin's eyes crinkled at the corners as he helped her up. "Does a body good to laugh sometimes," he admitted, brushing snow from his coat. Sarah used to say that. The mention of his late wife didn't bring the usual shadow to his face. Instead, his expression held a gentle remembrance that made Ruby's heart warm. Their good mood lasted through the afternoon as they finished hauling wood. But as dusk approached, the drumming of hoofbeats in the distance made them both freeze. Ruby's hand flew to her throat as 5 riders emerged from the gathering shadows. Kevin stepped in front of her protectively, his stance wary but firm. Ruby recognized her uncle's foreman among the riders, but her heart sank at the sight of Preacher Josiah Wainwright at their head. The circuit preacher's stern face held no trace of Christian mercy as he reined his horse to a stop. "Kevin Boone," the preacher's voice rang out, heavy with judgment. "We've come about this sinful situation you're harboring." "There's no sin here, preacher," Kevin replied evenly, "just offering shelter to someone in need." Wainwright's eyes narrowed. "A young woman living alone with an unmarried man? The whole town's talking about the scandal. She needs to return to her rightful guardian." Ruby stepped forward, though her knees trembled. "My uncle cast me out. He has no claim on me now." "You're living in sin, girl," Wainwright declared, "leading this man into temptation. Is that how you honor your Christian upbringing?" Tears stung Ruby's eyes at the cruel accusation, but Kevin's voice cut through her shame like a blade through ice. "Ruby's under my protection," he stated firmly. "She's done nothing wrong, and neither have I. Your gossip won't change that." The preacher drew himself up, his face darkening. "You'll both answer to God for this impropriety. The town won't stand for such wickedness in our midst." "Then it's good we answer to God, not town gossip," Kevin replied. His tone was respectful but unbending. "Good evening, gentlemen. The weather's turning. Best ride home before dark." The threat of approaching night and the steel in Kevin's voice seemed to sway the men. With final dark looks and muttered warnings, they turned their horses and rode away. Ruby watched them go, her whole body shaking now that the confrontation was over. "Oh, Kevin," she whispered, wrapping her arms around herself. "What they must think of me. Of us." Kevin turned to her, his face gentle despite the anger still smoldering in his eyes. He knelt beside her in the snow, making their eyes level. "God knows our hearts," he said softly but firmly. "That's all that matters." Ruby stared at him, seeing the truth and conviction in his weathered face. This man who had opened his door to her, who had defended her honor without hesitation, who treated her with unfailing respect, he was right. God did know their hearts. They went inside as true darkness fell. Ruby lit the lamp while Kevin built up the fire, its warmth slowly driving away the chill of confrontation. Neither felt the need to speak as they prepared their evening meal. The silence between them had changed, growing tender rather than awkward. As Ruby set out their tin plates, she realized something had shifted. The preacher's accusations, instead of driving them apart, had somehow drawn them closer. Their shared faith and mutual trust had withstood the test of public judgment. Kevin sat across from her, the lamplight casting soft shadows on his face. His bow of grace over their simple meal seemed deeper tonight, more heartfelt. Ruby found herself watching him, seeing past his gruff exterior to the gentle soul beneath. They sat together long after the meal was cleared away, taking comfort in each other's presence. The lamp burned low, but neither moved to trim it. Outside, the wind sang through the pines, but inside the cabin, peace reigned. They had chosen faith over fear, companionship over condemnation, and in that choice, Ruby felt her heart growing stronger, like a winter flower blooming against all odds. The snow fell thicker with each passing day, blanketing the mountains in deep drifts that turned the world white and silent. The weather forced Kevin and Ruby to spend more time inside the line shack, where the close quarters made them increasingly aware of each other's presence. One morning, Kevin sat cross-legged by the fire, his weathered hands moving methodically over his collection of steel traps. The metal needed regular maintenance to prevent rust, especially in the damp winter air. Ruby watched him work while she stirred a pot of beans, fascinated by his careful attention to detail. "Would you mind if I sang a bit?" she asked hesitantly. "My mama always said work goes faster with a song." Kevin glanced up, his eyes warm. "Reckon I'd like that just fine." Ruby's voice was soft at first, barely above a whisper as she began an old hymn her mother had taught her. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. The familiar words filled the cabin with gentle comfort. As she continued, her confidence grew, and her clear soprano rose and fell like a mountain stream. Kevin's hands slowed on the traps, though he tried to pretend he wasn't listening. But Ruby noticed how his shoulders relaxed, the usual furrow in his brow smoothing away as she moved from hymns to simple folk songs. The morning passed peacefully, marked by the rhythm of work and song. That evening, as the wind howled outside their walls, Kevin pulled out his rifle and revolver, laying them carefully on the rough-hewn table. "Time you learned about these," he said seriously. "Frontier ain't always friendly, and you need to know how to protect yourself." Ruby set aside her mending and moved closer, determined to prove herself capable. Kevin showed her how to oil the weapons properly, explaining each part's purpose with patient detail. "This here's the firing pin," he demonstrated on the rifle. "Needs to be kept clean and smooth, or it might not strike true when you need it most." His big hands were surprisingly gentle as he worked, showing the respect such tools demanded. Ruby listened intently, her brow furrowed in concentration. "What dangers should I watch for?" she asked, wanting to understand everything. Kevin's face grew grave. "Bears sometimes, though they're mostly denned up now. Wolves get bold in winter when game is scarce. And," he hesitated, then continued honestly, "sometimes men can be the worst threat of all. That's why you need to know how to handle these." Ruby nodded solemnly, absorbing every detail of his instruction. "I won't be a burden to you," she promised quietly. "I'll learn whatever I need to." Kevin's eyes met hers, something unreadable flickering in their depths. "You ain't never been a burden, Ruby. Not once since you got here." The warmth in his voice made her cheeks flush, and she quickly looked down at the weapons again. Kevin cleared his throat and continued the lesson. showing her how to check the revolver's cylinder and clean the barrel properly. Later that night, after Ruby had retired to her pallet near the fire, Kevin sat in his chair, staring into the flames. The familiar battle raged inside him, loneliness warring with honor, desire with respect. Ruby's presence had awakened feelings he'd thought long buried with Sarah, but he refused to dishonor either woman by acting rashly. Ruby stirred in her sleep, murmuring softly, and Kevin's heart clenched. He couldn't bear the thought of anyone thinking ill of her, of gossip staining her reputation. Finally, he could keep silent no longer. "Ruby," he called softly, waiting until she sat up, wrapping her quilt around her shoulders. "There's something needs saying." She looked at him expectantly, her face glowing in the firelight. Kevin took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "I respect you too much to let town gossip define what's between us," he said firmly. "Don't care what the preacher or anyone else thinks. You're a lady, and I aim to treat you as one." Ruby's cheeks blazed red, but she held his gaze. "Sometimes," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly, "I dream of being chosen by a man of worth, someone who sees me for who I am, not just how I look." The naked honesty in her words struck Kevin like a physical blow. He looked at her with new tenderness, seeing the courage it took to speak such truth. The firelight caught the gold highlights in her hair, and for a moment, he couldn't find words to respond. Finally, he stood abruptly, breaking the charged moment between them. "Best we have some supper," he said gruffly, though his eyes remained gentle. "Storm's likely to keep us in tomorrow, too." Ruby nodded, rising to help him prepare their simple meal. Outside, the wind howled with increasing fury, rattling the shutters and driving snow against the walls. But inside, the tension had transformed into something warmer, an unspoken awareness that hummed between them like a plucked string. They ate in comfortable silence, sharing the last of the venison stew. The lamp cast dancing shadows on the walls, and the fire popped and crackled in the hearth. Ruby found herself stealing glances at Kevin's strong profile, wondering at how natural it felt to share this small space with him. After the dishes were cleaned and put away, Ruby moved to the window. Her breath fogged the frosted pane, and on impulse, she lifted her finger to write in the condensation. Slowly, carefully, she traced out her name. Ruby. She smiled faintly at the sight, remembering how she used to do the same thing as a child on her mother's kitchen window. Behind her, she heard Kevin moving about, banking the fire for the night, and her smile deepened. Here, in this simple cabin with this honorable man, she felt more at home than she had in years. The name remained visible on the window, a delicate declaration of presence, of belonging. Ruby stood looking at it until the frost began to claim it back, wondering what tomorrow might bring. The storm continued its assault outside, but within these walls, something new and precious was growing, as yet unnamed, but undeniable. Dawn broke over the mountains, revealing a sky scrubbed clean by the passing storm. Sunlight sparkled off fresh snow, and icicles dripped steadily from the cabin's eaves. Kevin stood in the doorway, breathing in the crisp morning air while Ruby tidied up their breakfast dishes inside. "Looks like we can finally make that supply run," he called over his shoulder. Storms broke clean through. Ruby appeared beside him, wrapping her shawl tighter against the cold. "The road to town should be passable now?" Kevin nodded, studying the crystalline sky. "Might be rough in spots, but the wagon can handle it." He glanced at her, noting the flutter of anxiety across her face. "You ain't got to come if you'd rather not." "No," Ruby said firmly, though her hands twisted in her shawl. "We need supplies, and I won't hide forever. Besides," she added with a small smile, "someone needs to make sure you don't forget the coffee." Kevin's laugh rumbled deep in his chest as he headed to the barn to hitch up the wagon. Ruby watched him go, trying to quiet the nervous flutter in her stomach. This would be their first time in town together, their first time facing the whispers and stares she knew would come. The wagon creaked and swayed as they made their way down the mountain trail. Kevin had padded the wooden seat with extra blankets, and Ruby sat close to his side, drawing comfort from his solid presence. The morning sun cast long shadows across the snow, and their breath, frosted in the air. As they approached the town, Ruby's anxiety grew. She clutched her mother's hymnal to her chest like a shield, its worn leather familiar under her fingers. Kevin seemed to sense her unease, for he slowed the horses to a gentle walk as they passed the first scattered buildings. The main street was already busy with morning traffic. Heads turned as Kevin guided the wagon toward the general store, and Ruby felt the weight of curious stares. She heard the whispers start, saw the knowing looks passed between townspeople. Ain't that the Mayfield girl? Living up there with that mountain man? Shameless, if you ask me. Kevin's jaw tightened, but he kept his eyes forward, helping Ruby down from the wagon with careful courtesy. His tall frame seemed to grow even larger as he positioned himself between her and the worst of the stairs. A silent barrier of protection. Inside the store, the whispers followed them. Ruby focused on their shopping list, trying to ignore the smirking men who lounged near the pot-bellied stove and the group of women who tittered behind their hands near the fabric counter. As she examined the coffee beans, a small voice piped up beside her. "That's a mighty fine book you got there, ma'am." Ruby turned to find a young boy, perhaps 10 years old, looking at her hymnal with genuine interest. His freckled face held no judgment, only curiosity. "Thank you," she said softly, warmth flooding her chest at this simple kindness. "It was my mother's. Would you like to see inside?" The boy nodded eagerly, and Ruby carefully opened the book, showing him the delicate pages filled with familiar hymns. "My favorite is Amazing Grace," she told him, pointing to the well-worn page. "My ma sings that one too," the boy exclaimed, before his mother hurried over to pull him away with a disapproving glare at Ruby. Kevin, who had been selecting ammunition nearby, moved closer to Ruby's side. His presence was like a wall of strength, and the sneers from the loafers by the stove died away under his steady gaze. At the counter, Mr. Peterson, the storekeeper, eyed their pile of supplies with obvious hesitation. "Don't usually extend credit to folks without proper arrangements," he said, not quite meeting their eyes. "Don't need credit," Kevin replied evenly, dropping a bundle of prime furs on the counter. "These ought to cover it fair and square." Peterson's eyebrows rose as he examined the pelts. "These are mighty fine furs, Mr. Boone. Reckon they'll do just fine." His tone warmed considerably as he began tallying their purchases. Ruby kept her head high as they loaded the wagon, though inside she was trembling. She could still hear the whispers, still feel the judgment in every sidelong glance. Kevin worked efficiently, securing their supplies while maintaining his protective presence. As they drove out of town, Ruby finally let her composure crack. Silent tears rolled down her cheeks, and she pressed her hands to her face in shame. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm sorry for bringing such scandal to your door." Kevin pulled the wagon to a stop, turning to face her fully. "Now you listen here," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "You showed more courage in there than any man jack of them. Walking tall, treating that boy with kindness despite their ugliness. That's real strength, Ruby." Ruby lowered her hands, meeting his earnest gaze. "You really think so?" "I know so," he replied. "Ain't nothing shameful about you, Ruby Mayfield. Nothing at all." Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks, but these were different. Tears of gratitude and something deeper she wasn't ready to name. Her hand found his sleeve, fingers curling into the rough fabric, holding on as if to anchor herself to his certainty. The rest of the journey passed in comfortable silence as they wound their way back into the mountains. The afternoon sun painted the snow in shades of gold and pink, and the horses' hooves made a steady rhythm against the packed trail. Ruby's hand remained on Kevin's sleeve, neither of them acknowledging this small point of connection that seemed to say more than words could express. Evening was settling in by the time they reached the cabin. They worked together to unload the wagon and settle the horses, moving in the easy harmony they had developed over their weeks together. The familiar tasks helped settle Ruby's scattered emotions, grounding her in the present moment. Later, as they sat by the fire with cups of fresh coffee, Ruby finally found words for what was in her heart. "I've never felt so seen before," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the crackling flames. "The way you stood by me today, the way you see past what others say." Kevin's hands tightened around his coffee cup, and something deep stirred in his eyes as he looked at her. But he only nodded, understanding that words might shatter this delicate moment between them. Some truths were better left in silence, held careful and close like precious things. The fire cast dancing shadows on the cabin walls as they sat together, each lost in their own thoughts but somehow more connected than ever before. Outside, the stars began to appear in the crystal-clear sky, witnesses to the quiet transformation taking place within the humble line shack's walls. The mountain morning dawned crisp and clear, sunlight sparkling off fresh snow. Ruby stood at the cabin door, watching Kevin check his trap lines in the distance. Her breath clouded in the cold air as she gathered her resolve. She had spent too many days being a burden. It was time to prove her worth. When Kevin returned, stamping snow from his boots, Ruby met him with determination bright in her eyes. "I want to learn," she announced. "Everything you do, all the work that needs doing. I aim to pull my weight proper." Kevin paused in the doorway, studying her face. "Ain't easy work," he warned, but Ruby could see approval warming his expression. "I'm stronger than I look," she replied, lifting her chin, "and I'm tired of being called useless." Over the next several days, Ruby threw herself into learning every task she could. Kevin proved a patient teacher, his big hands surprisingly gentle as he showed her how to skin the rabbits they caught. The first time, Ruby's stomach turned at the sight, but she pressed on, determined. "Like this," Kevin demonstrated, his knife moving with practiced ease. "Clean cuts, careful-like, don't want to waste nothing." Ruby's attempts were clumsy at first, but she improved with each try. By the fourth rabbit, her cuts were nearly as neat as his. Kevin's quiet, "well done," meant more to her than any praise she'd ever received. The mending came more naturally to her fingers. One evening, she noticed Kevin's coat had torn at the sleeve. Without a word, she took it while he slept, stitching it by firelight with careful tiny stitches that would hold against the wind. When Kevin found it mended the next morning, he ran his fingers over her work with something like wonder. "Ain't had nobody care for my things since." He trailed off, but Ruby understood, since his wife had passed. "Well, now you do," she said simply, and turned to stir the morning porridge before he could see the color in her cheeks. Music filled their days, too. Ruby had always found comfort in hymns, and now she sang as she worked, while washing dishes, gathering kindling, or mending clothes. At first, she sang softly, almost to herself, but gradually her voice grew stronger. One evening, after Kevin returned bone-weary from clearing a fallen tree, Ruby saw the exhaustion in his face. Without thinking, she began to sing "Amazing Grace," her voice clear and sweet in the cabin's quiet. Kevin sank into his chair, eyes closed, as her voice wrapped around him like a warm blanket. When she finished, he opened his eyes and gave her a smile that made her heart skip. "Reckon that's better medicine than any doctor could give," he said softly. As the week progressed, Ruby found herself thinking more and more about making the cabin a true home. She gathered scraps of fabric, bits of old shirts, a worn blanket, even the clean parts of feed sacks, and began piecing them together in the evenings. Kevin noticed her working one night as he came in from his last check of the horses. Ruby sat cross-legged by the fire, carefully stitching patches together. The lamplight caught the concentration on her face, the way her fingers moved surely despite their work-roughened state. "What's that you're making?" he asked, settling into his chair. "A quilt," Ruby replied, holding up her work so he could see the pattern emerging. "Ain't much, just scraps. But it'll be warm when it's done. And pretty too, I hope." Kevin stared at the simple squares taking shape under her hands, and something shifted in his chest. This wasn't just busy work. This was homemaking. The kind of gentle touch his cabin hadn't seen in years. The kind of touch he'd told himself he didn't need anymore. The fire crackled softly as Ruby worked, and Kevin found himself speaking without meaning to. "Come spring," he said, his voice rough, "this place is gonna seem mighty empty." Ruby's hand stilled on the quilt. "Does it have to?" she asked, barely above a whisper, her heart thundering in her chest. Kevin stood abruptly, pacing to the window. The night pressed dark against the glass, stars sharp as diamond chips in the clear sky. He could feel the weight of all he wanted to say pressing against his chest. "Ruby," he said finally, turning to face her, "I ain't got much. This cabin, my traps, some horses. It ain't the kind of life most women would want." Ruby set aside her quilting, rising to her feet. "I ain't most women," she said softly. "No," Kevin agreed, taking a step toward her. "No, you sure ain't." He drew a deep breath, as if gathering courage. "These past weeks, having you here, it's like the sun came out after a long winter. I wake up looking forward to each day, hearing you sing, seeing you make this place into something more than just walls and a roof." Tears began to slip down Ruby's cheeks, but she didn't move to wipe them away. "I know I ain't the kind of man your kin would choose for you," Kevin continued, his voice growing hoarse with emotion. I'm rough, set in my ways, but I swear before God, I'd spend every day trying to deserve you." He crossed the room to stand before her, taking her work-worn hands in his. "Ruby Mayfield, would you consider staying, not just till spring, but forever? As my wife?" Ruby's breath caught in her throat. For a moment, she couldn't speak, overwhelmed by the love she saw in Kevin's eyes. This man who had given her shelter, who had defended her against all comers, who had taught her she wasn't worthless after all. This good, honorable man wanted her as his wife. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, joy breaking through like sunlight. "Yes, Kevin Boone, I will stay forever." Kevin's hands tightened on hers, and tears shone in his own eyes. "We should pray," he said roughly. "Ask God's blessing on this promise." Together, they knelt by the fireplace. Ruby's voice trembled as she began. "Dear Lord, we come before you with grateful hearts." Kevin's deep voice joined hers, uncertain but sincere, as they asked for guidance and blessing on their future together. When they finished, Ruby reached for her unfinished quilt and drew it around both their shoulders, a simple gesture that spoke of shared warmth, shared life. "Our first quilt," she said softly, tears of happiness streaming down her cheeks as she leaned against Kevin's shoulder. Kevin's arm came around her, strong and sure. "First of many," he promised, his voice thick with emotion. "First of many things we'll share." The fire burned warm and bright as they sat together, wrapped in the promise of tomorrow, their hearts beating in time with a joy too deep for words. The morning of their wedding day dawned crisp and bright, sunlight sparkling off fresh snow. Ruby stood at the cabin's single window, watching her breath frost the glass as she smoothed her patched dress with trembling hands. A week had passed since Kevin's proposal, just long enough for word to reach their closest neighbors, the Hendersons, who lived 3 miles down the valley. Sarah Henderson had arrived early, bringing a small bouquet of dried flowers tied with a faded blue ribbon. "Something pretty for a bride," she'd said warmly, pressing them into Ruby's hands. The gesture had brought tears to Ruby's eyes. It was more kindness than she'd expected from anyone outside these cabin walls. Now Sarah helped Ruby pin up her hair, her gentle fingers working through the thick brown strands. "There now," she said, stepping back to admire her work. "You look beautiful, child." Ruby caught her reflection in the window glass. Her cheeks were flushed pink with excitement, her eyes bright. The dress might be patched, but she'd scrubbed it clean and pressed it carefully. She touched the dried flowers pinned at her waist, their subtle fragrance a reminder that beauty could last through winter. Outside, she heard men's voices. Kevin talking with Thomas Henderson, who would read the ceremony. Ruby's heart fluttered. In all her life, she'd never thought to have a wedding day, not after years of her uncle's cruel words about her size and worth. But Kevin saw her differently. Kevin had chosen her. Sarah squeezed her hand. "Ready?" Ruby nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. They stepped outside into the bright winter afternoon. Kevin stood waiting by the cabin door, cleaned up and wearing his best shirt, though it was worn at the cuffs. His eyes found hers immediately, and the look in them made Ruby's breath catch. The Hendersons' 3 children had scattered pine branches on the snow, making a path to where Thomas stood holding his Bible. It wasn't much of a wedding party, just 6 people besides the bride and groom. But to Ruby, it was perfect. Kevin held out his hand as she approached. His palm was warm against hers, steady and sure, as they faced Thomas together. The mountain peaks rose behind them, silent witnesses to their vows. Thomas opened his Bible, his voice clear in the winter air. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here in the sight of God to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony." Ruby felt tears sliding down her cheeks as Kevin's deep voice promised to love and cherish her all the days of his life. When her turn came, her voice shook but held strong. "I, Ruby, take thee, Kevin, to be my wedded husband." The simple gold band Kevin slipped onto her finger had belonged to his mother. It was slightly too big, but Ruby didn't care. She placed a plain brass ring on Kevin's finger, all they could afford from the general store. But the love in his eyes made it seem as precious as diamonds. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder," Thomas proclaimed. "I now pronounce you man and wife." Kevin's kiss was gentle, mindful of their audience, but Ruby felt it all the way to her toes. Sarah Henderson wiped tears from her eyes while her children clapped and cheered. They celebrated inside the cabin afterward, the small space filled with more joy than Ruby had ever known. Sarah had brought a cake, simple but sweet, and everyone shared cups of coffee. The Henderson children taught Ruby a clapping game, while Kevin and Thomas talked quietly by the fire. Soon hymn singing filled the cabin. Ruby's clear voice led Amazing Grace, while Kevin's deeper tones joined in. No longer shy about singing with her, even the children knew the words, their high voices lifting to the rafters. As afternoon faded toward evening, the Hendersons prepared to leave. "Best get home before dark," Thomas said, helping his wife with her shawl. The children hugged Ruby goodbye, the youngest pressing a pine cone into her hand for luck. Sarah embraced Ruby tightly. "You've got a good man there," she whispered, "and he's got himself a fine wife." Then they were gone, the sound of their wagon fading into the gathering dusk. Ruby stood in the doorway watching until they disappeared around the bend, Kevin's arm warm around her waist. "Welcome home, Mrs. Boone," he said softly, and Ruby's heart soared at the name. They prepared supper together, moving around each other in the small space as if they'd done it for years. Ruby's hands brushed Kevin's as she passed him bread to go with the rabbit stew. Such a simple meal, but to Ruby it felt like a feast. The cabin glowed with lamplight as they sat down to eat. Kevin reached across the table to take her hand, his thumb running across her new ring. "Never thought I'd have this again," he said roughly. "A home, a wife, someone to share my days. God is good," Ruby replied softly, squeezing his hand. "He brought me to your door that night, though I was so scared. Now I know why." After they finished eating, Ruby rose to clear the dishes, but Kevin caught her hand. "Leave them," he said. "Just come sit with me a spell." They settled by the fire, Ruby's head resting against Kevin's shoulder. The night felt holy somehow, wrapped in peace and promise. Even the wind seemed gentler, carrying no bite of winter's chill. "Should thank the Lord proper," Ruby murmured after a while. "For bringing us together, for this day." Kevin nodded, and they knelt together on the rough wooden floor. Ruby had just opened her Bible when the sound of hoofbeats broke the silence. Kevin stiffened, his hand going to Ruby's shoulder. "Stay inside," he said, rising smoothly to his feet. He grabbed his rifle from its place by the door, then stepped out into the darkness. Ruby pressed close to the window, her heart pounding. In the moonlight, she could make out several mounted figures, the same men who'd come before, led by her uncle's foreman. But, this time, the sheriff was with them. "Kevin Boone," the sheriff's voice carried clearly. "I have a warrant for your arrest." "What charges?" Kevin's voice was steady, but Ruby could hear the tension in it. "Enticement and fraud," the foreman spat, "taking advantage of a dependent female, stealing her from her rightful guardian." "That's lies." Ruby burst through the door, ignoring Kevin's warning gesture. "I came here of my own free will. We're married now, proper and legal, which makes the crime worse," the sheriff said grimly. Two deputies dismounted, chains rattling in their hands. "Step forward, Boone. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." "No," Ruby screamed as the deputies grabbed Kevin's arms. Her Bible tumbled from her hands into the snow as she tried to reach him. "You can't take him. He's my husband." Kevin didn't struggle as they chained his wrists, but his eyes found Ruby's in the darkness. "It'll be all right," he said softly. "Trust in the Lord, Ruby. I'll come back to you." They forced him onto a horse, the chains clinking with cruel finality. Ruby collapsed to her knees in the snow, watching helplessly as they led Kevin away. Her fingers found her fallen Bible, clutching it to her chest as sobs tore from her throat. "Please, God," she begged, rocking back and forth in the moonlight. "Please don't let them take him. Please don't take him from me. Not now. Not when we've only just begun." But only the wind answered her prayers as the sound of hoofbeats faded into the night, taking her new husband with them. The iron bars clanged shut behind Kevin with a hollow finality. The town jail's single cell felt like an icebox, winter seeping through the stone walls despite the meager fire in the pot-bellied stove. His wrists ached where the chains had bitten into them during the long ride from the cabin. Sheriff Morton tossed Kevin a thin blanket through the bars. "Best get comfortable, Boone. Judge won't be here till next week," Kevin said. Nothing. Settling onto the narrow cot. His thoughts were with Ruby, alone in their cabin. But when he closed his eyes, boots scraped on wooden floorboards. Uncle Horace Mayfield had arrived. "Well, if it ain't the mountain man who thought he could steal my property," Mayfield sneered, standing just beyond the cell bars. His expensive coat reeked of whiskey. Ruby's back where she belongs now. My men collected her this morning. Kevin's hands clenched into fists, but he kept his voice steady. She's my wife. We were married proper, with witnesses. Marriage, Mayfield barked a laugh. To that fat, useless girl? You must have been desperate indeed, Boone. Or maybe you thought you could get your hands on some of my ranch money through her. You're wrong about her, Kevin said quietly, though rage burned in his chest. Ruby's worth 10 of you. We'll see what the judge says about that. Mayfield adjusted his hat with a smirk. Meanwhile, she's locked up nice and safe in my ranch house. Maybe some time alone will teach her who really owns her. Kevin surged to his feet, but Mayfield had already turned away, chuckling as he left the jail. The sheriff shook his head. Settle down, Boone. Making trouble won't help your case. Days crawled by like molasses in winter. Kevin paced the small cell, 7 steps each way, marking time by the wan sunlight that filtered through the barred window. Every morning, the deputy brought thin gruel and hard bread. Every afternoon, there were more questions. Did you force the girl to stay with you? Sheriff Morton would ask, scratching notes in his ledger. She came of her own free will, Kevin repeated, his voice hoarse from saying the same words over and over. She chose to marry me. Ask the Hendersons. They witnessed our vows. Thomas Henderson's place is 3 days' ride away, the sheriff said. Convenient that. And mighty strange you'd rush to marry a girl you barely knew. Kevin stared at his hands, remembering how they'd trembled when placing the ring on Ruby's finger. Some things you just know in your heart, he said quietly. Nights were the hardest. The cell grew bitter cold, and Kevin huddled under the thin blanket, remembering warmer evenings. Ruby's smile in the firelight, the sound of her hymns filling their small cabin, the way she'd looked at him during their wedding, like he was something precious. Lord, he whispered into the darkness, keep her safe. Give her strength. Let her know she's not alone. Miles away at the Mayfield Ranch, Ruby sat in a bare room at the top of the house. Her uncle had ordered the windows nailed shut, though they were too small to climb through anyway. A lock clicked on the outside of the door whenever meals were brought, usually just bread and water, sometimes cold beans. Eating less might do you good, her uncle had sneered that first day, shoving her into the room. Though I reckon nothing'll fix what's wrong with you. That mountain man must have been addled to want such a burden. Ruby had held her head high, though tears burned behind her eyes. Kevin loves me for who I am, she'd declared. God brought us together, and no earthly power can break that bond. God? Uncle Horace had laughed. God helps those who help themselves, girl. And you've never been anything but helpless. But Ruby refused to be broken. Each morning, she knelt by the narrow window, watching the sun rise over the mountains. She could see the peaks where her cabin, their cabin, waited, where she'd known real happiness for the first time. With a nail she'd worked loose from the floorboards, Ruby carefully scratched hymn verses into the wooden windowsill. Amazing grace. How sweet the sound. She carved, the words barely visible but deep enough to feel with her fingers. That saved a wretch like me. The words brought comfort, reminding her of evenings singing while Kevin listened, his deep voice gradually joining hers. She touched her wedding ring, still snug, on her finger. They hadn't thought to take it from her. The simple band was proof that everything had been real, that she wasn't the worthless burden her uncle claimed. Sometimes at night, she heard the ranch hands laughing below her window. Poor Boone, one would say. Desperate enough to marry the fat girl. Maybe jail's better than that fate. Ruby pressed her hands over her ears, drowning out their cruel words with prayer. Lord, give me strength, she whispered. Let Kevin know I'm thinking of him. Let him feel my love across the miles. Days blurred together, marked only by meager meals and the slow progress of her carved hymns along the windowsill. Ruby's stomach often growled with hunger, but she held on to her dignity. When her uncle visited to mock her, she met his eyes steadily, though her heart trembled. The judge will see reason, he told her one evening, his shadow falling across her huddled form. You're not fit to make your own choices. That marriage was a sham, and Boone will pay for taking advantage of my ward. I chose him, Ruby said firmly. I choose him still. You can't change that. We'll see. Her uncle's boots thudded across the floor. A few more weeks of solitude might change your mind about a lot of things. But solitude only strengthened Ruby's resolve. Each night, She knelt by her bed just as she had in the cabin, though now she prayed alone. The words were different, but the faith behind them burned just as bright. "Watch over Kevin, Lord," she prayed, her fingers tracing the worn pages of her Bible. "Keep his spirit strong. Help him know that I'm waiting, that I'll always wait for him. And please, please don't let them break us apart." In his cold cell, Kevin pressed his hand against the rough stone wall, facing the direction of the ranch where he knew Ruby was imprisoned. Though miles separated them, their prayers rose together into the winter night, two hearts bound by love and faith, stronger than iron bars or locked doors. The moon crossed the sky, casting bars of silver light through both their windows. Neither knew the other knelt praying at that same hour, but somehow their souls recognized the connection. Their shared faith became a bridge across the distance, holding them steady until dawn broke again over the Colorado mountains. Word spread through Miller's Creek like wildfire on a dry prairie. By Sunday morning, the little white church buzzed with whispers and sidelong glances as Preacher Wainwright mounted his pulpit, his face stern as granite. "Brothers and sisters," he thundered, his fist striking the wooden lectern, "we have a wolf among our flock." His dark eyes swept across the congregation, settling on familiar faces. A man who claims the Lord's blessing while living in sin. Kevin Boone, that mountain dweller, has taken advantage of an innocent ward. The congregation shifted uneasily in their hard wooden pews. Several women clutched their prayer books tighter, while others nodded in agreement. "He cloaks his desires in false marriage," Wainwright continued, his voice rising. "But can a union built on deceit be blessed by our Lord? I say no." He lifted his Bible high. "Wolves come in sheep's clothing, seeking to devour the innocent." Yet even as heads bobbed in agreement, doubt crept in like morning mist. Martha Jensen leaned close to her neighbor, whispering behind her hand, "Seems mighty strange, don't it? Horace Mayfield never cared 2 cents about that niece before." "Hush now," her friend whispered back, though her brow furrowed thoughtfully. "But I did see that girl in town with Boone. She seemed happy enough, following him like a faithful shadow." The whispers multiplied, spreading through town like ripples in a pond. At the general store, old Tom Wilson scratched his beard thoughtfully. Never known Boone to be anything but honest in his dealings. Paid fair for that line shack, he did. Meanwhile, at the Mayfield ranch, Ruby sat rigid at the long supper table, her uncle at its head. The roast beef on her plate grew cold as she gathered her courage, hands trembling beneath the tablecloth. "Uncle," she said finally, her voice stronger than she felt, "I want to see the guardianship papers." Horace Mayfield's fork clattered against his plate. He dabbed his mouth with a napkin, dark eyes narrowing. "What did you say, girl?" "The papers," Ruby repeated, lifting her chin. "The ones that give you authority over me. I have a right to see them." Her uncle's laugh was sharp as broken glass. "Rights? You speak of rights?" He pushed back from the table, looming over her. "You're nothing but a burden I took in from Christian charity. You'll see nothing. Then, perhaps there's nothing to see," Ruby said quietly, though her heart hammered against her ribs. The back of his hand caught her cheek, snapping her head sideways. "Get to your room," he snarled. "No supper for such insolence." Ruby climbed the stairs slowly, her cheek stinging, but instead of entering her room, she pressed herself against the wall of the darkened hallway, listening. Voices drifted up from her uncle's study below. The girl's getting bold. She heard her uncle tell his foreman, "We need to move faster." "Papers are solid enough," the foreman replied. "Nobody's going to question them too hard." "They'd better not." Horace's chair creaked. "Took me 3 days to get those forgeries right. Nobody's taking my free labor away, not after all these years of feeding and clothing that useless girl." Ruby pressed her hands to her mouth, stifling a gasp. The truth hit her like a physical blow. There had never been any legal guardianship. All these years of mockery and cruelty had been built on lies. Tears burned her eyes, but determination hardened in her chest like iron. She would not let this injustice stand. Kevin languished in jail while her uncle spun his web of deceit. Someone had to know the truth. That night, Ruby waited until the house grew still. The moon cast silver patterns through her window as she pulled on her warmest dress and Kevin's old coat, which she'd managed to keep hidden. Her Bible and a crust of bread went into the coat's deep pockets. The door was still locked, but Ruby had spent days working at the hinges with her hidden nail. They creaked softly as she lifted the door just enough to squeeze through. Her heart thundered so loudly she feared it would wake the house as she crept down the back stairs. The night air bit through her clothes as she slipped out the kitchen door. Snow had fallen fresh, making each step a struggle as she trudged toward town. The stars wheeled overhead, cold and distant, as Ruby pushed herself forward mile after mile. Dawn was breaking, pale and grudging, when her legs finally gave out. She stumbled and fell face first into a snowdrift, her body shaking with exhaustion and cold. Tears froze on her cheeks as she tried to rise, only to collapse again. "Please, Lord," she whispered through chattering teeth. "Don't let it end here." The crunch of wagon wheels made her lift her head. Through blurred vision, she saw a small cart approaching, drawn by a single horse. A native woman sat at the reins, wrapped in bright blankets against the cold. The wagon stopped. Warm brown eyes studied Ruby with concern. "You are far from shelter, sister," the woman said in clear English. "What brings you to this trail at dawn?" Ruby's voice cracked. "I'm trying to reach town. To save my husband." The woman climbed down, her movements graceful despite her heavy wraps. "I am Naya," she said, helping Ruby to her feet. "The town does not welcome my kind, but I have a warm cabin nearby. You need rest and heat before you can help anyone." Ruby swayed, grateful for the strong hands supporting her. "Why would you help me? You don't know me." Naya's smile was gentle but sad. "I know what it is to be pushed aside by those who think themselves better. Come. I have soup and fire." Gratitude welled up in Ruby's heart as Naya helped her into the wagon. The woman tucked a thick blanket around her, clucking softly at Ruby's cold hands. "Thank you," Ruby whispered, tears threatening again. "I don't deserve such kindness." "All God's children deserve kindness," Naya replied, clicking to her horse, "even when the world forgets to give it." The wagon creaked along a narrow trail through the trees. Ruby huddled under the blanket, watching the sun rise over the mountains. For the first time since Kevin's arrest, hope stirred in her chest. Perhaps God had not abandoned them after all. Naya's cabin appeared around a bend, small but well-maintained, with smoke curling from its chimney. Bright woven blankets hung at the windows, and dried herbs swayed from the porch beams. "Rest first," Naya said firmly, helping Ruby down. "Then you will tell me how I can help save your husband." Ruby followed her rescuer into the warm cabin, breathing in the scent of sage and pine smoke. Outside, the morning sun touched the snowy peaks with gold, promise breaking over the Colorado wilderness like a new day. Naya's cabin glowed with warmth and welcome after Ruby's desperate journey through the snow. Herbs hung in fragrant bundles from the rafters, and a pot of something savory bubbled over the hearth. Ruby sank onto a wooden chair, her frozen limbs slowly thawing in the cabin's embrace. "Drink this," Naya said, pressing a steaming cup of pine needle tea into Ruby's trembling hands. "It will warm you from within." Ruby sipped gratefully, watching as her hostess moved about the small space with quiet grace. A cry from the back room drew Naya away briefly. When she returned, she carried a small child, no more than 2 years old, with skin the warm brown of autumn leaves and eyes that sparkled like dark honey. "This is my son, Little Fox," Naya said softly, settling the boy on her hip. "He is my joy, though his father brings me only sorrow." Ruby studied the child's features. There was something familiar in the set of his jaw, the arch of his brows. Her eyes widened as understanding dawned. "The preacher," she whispered. "Reverend Wainwright." Naya nodded, her face a mask of controlled pain. 3 years ago, he came to our people speaking of God's love. He spoke so beautifully of mercy, of acceptance. She stroked her son's dark hair. "I believed him when he said color meant nothing to the Creator, but when I told him I carried his child, his true nature showed itself." Ruby's heart ached as Naya continued. "He called me a temptress, said I had bewitched him. He gave me coins to go away, to keep silent." Her voice hardened. "I took his money only because I knew my son would need it. But I did not go far. I wanted him to know we lived, that his sin could not be buried so easily. That's why he speaks so harshly against Kevin and me," Ruby realized. "He fears his own secrets being revealed. Fear makes men cruel," Naya agreed, settling Little Fox with a wooden toy. "Your uncle fears losing control. The preacher fears losing respect. And so they build walls of lies to protect themselves." Ruby set down her empty cup, warmth and purpose flowing through her veins. Then it's time those walls came down. Will you help me? Naya's dark eyes met hers steadily. You would stand with me? Even knowing what the town thinks of my people? Truth is truth, Ruby said firmly. And you've shown me more Christian kindness than those who preach from pulpits. They spent the evening planning, while little Fox played at their feet. Naya shared soup and fresh bread, rebuilding Ruby's strength. As night fell, she insisted Ruby take her bed, saying, "Tomorrow will require all your courage." Dawn broke clear and cold. Ruby rose early, donning her freshly dried clothes. Naya pressed a bundle of food into her hands and led her to the small barn where a sturdy mare waited. "Take Shadow," Naya said, patting the horse's neck. "She knows the way to town." "I will. Follow with little Fox in the wagon. We have our own truth to tell." Ruby mounted carefully, gathering the reins. "I don't know how to thank you." "Stand tall," Naya replied simply. "That will be thanks enough." The ride into town passed in a blur of cold air and determination. Ruby's hands were steady on the reins as she guided Shadow through the streets. People stopped to stare, but she kept her eyes fixed ahead, where the courthouse loomed. She heard voices as she approached. The trial was already beginning. Sliding from Shadow's back, Ruby paused only long enough to straighten her skirts and touch the ring that hung on a cord beneath her collar. Then she climbed the courthouse steps, each footfall bringing her closer to justice. The heavy doors swung open at her touch. Warmth and lamplight spilled out, along with the droning voice of her uncle's lawyer. Kevin stood in chains before the judge, his broad shoulders straight despite his bonds. He turned at her entrance, joy and fear warring in his eyes. "Your Honor," Ruby's voice rang out, clear and strong. "I must speak." The courthouse erupted in whispers and gasps. Judge Harrison peered down from his bench, spectacles glinting. "Young woman, this is a court of law, not a social gathering." "I know, sir." Ruby moved forward, her steps steady despite her pounding heart. "But you cannot judge this case fairly without hearing from me, the one whose fate you debate." Her uncle rose from his seat, face mottled with rage. "Girl, you will be silent." "No, uncle." Ruby met his gaze without flinching. "I have been silent too long." The judge rapped his gavel. "Order. Miss Mayfield, since you are the subject of these proceedings, I will hear you. Approach the bench." Ruby walked past the rows of townsfolk, past her uncle's clenched fists, past the preacher's pale face. She felt Kevin's presence at her back, like warmth from a fire. "Your Honor, I am 19 years old, / my legal age to choose my own path. The papers, claiming my uncle's guardianship, are forged. He kept me as unpaid labor, nothing more." "Lies," her uncle shouted. "She's simple-minded, needs protection." "Then why did you trust me to manage your books?" Ruby countered. "To negotiate with merchants? To doctor your cattle?" She turned back to the judge. "Sir, I have my marriage lines here, recorded in our family Bible. Kevin Boone is my lawful husband, chosen freely and wed before witnesses." She drew out the Bible, opening to the page where their marriage was recorded in careful script. The judge examined it, frowning thoughtfully. "This appears properly witnessed," he said, "but Reverend Wainwright claims." "I have something to say about the Reverend's claims." A new voice rang from the doorway. Naya stood there, little Fox in her arms, wrapped in her brightest blanket. The preacher shot to his feet. "This is absurd. You cannot allow a savage to—" "Watch your tongue, Reverend," the judge warned. "The law hears all voices." He gestured to Naya. "Approach, madam." Naya walked forward with quiet dignity, her son watching the crowd with curious eyes. "I come to speak of truth and lies, of a man who preaches virtue while hiding his sins." She turned to face Wainwright. "Will you deny your own son, Josiah? Will you call me liar while he wears your face?" The courthouse exploded with shocked murmurs. Women covered their mouths with handkerchiefs. Men craned their necks to study little Fox's features. "This is outrageous," Wainwright sputtered, but his face had gone gray. "I never. She's trying to extort." "The money you paid me to disappear is still in its envelope," Naya said calmly. "With the note in your hand saying you never wanted to see me or the child again, shall I show it to the judge?" Ruby watched truth land like hammer blows. The preacher sagged in his seat, decades of righteousness crumbling to dust. Her uncle's face twisted with the knowledge that his allies were deserting him. The judge's gavel, cracked like thunder. "Order! I will have order!" He glared down at the assemblage until silence fell. "It seems," he said heavily, "that we have been presented with evidence of multiple deceptions. Miss Mayfield, Mrs. Boone, your marriage appears legal and binding, and these accusations of misconduct against your husband appear to be." He glanced at her uncle's thunderous face, motivated by concerns other than justice. Hope bloomed in Ruby's chest as the judge continued, "Unless substantial evidence of wrongdoing is presented immediately, I have no choice but to dismiss all charges against Kevin Boone." The courthouse held its breath. Ruby's uncle half rose, mouth working, but no words came. The preacher stared at his hands, shoulders slumped in defeat. "Very well." The judge nodded to the bailiff. "Remove Mr. Boone's chains." The iron cuffs fell away with a clank. Kevin stepped forward, rubbing his wrists, his eyes never leaving Ruby's face. She wanted to run to him but held herself still, waiting for the judge's final words. "This case is dismissed. Mr. Boone, you are free to go. Mrs. Boone, you are declared legally independent of your uncle's authority." He peered at Naya over his spectacles. "Madam, if you wish to file charges regarding the support of your child, I want only truth," Naya replied, "and perhaps for my son to know his father's people need not be his enemies." The judge nodded slowly. "Truth has been spoken here today. Let us hope it bears good fruit." His gavel fell one final time. "This court is adjourned." The room erupted in motion and voices. Ruby felt Kevin's arms wrap around her, strong and sure. Over his shoulder, she saw Naya slip quietly toward the door, Little Fox waving goodbye with a tiny hand. Their eyes met in a moment of shared understanding, two women who had found courage to speak truth to power, to choose justice over shame. Ruby's uncle stormed past without a word, his boots striking sparks from the floorboards. The preacher followed more slowly, pausing to look at Little Fox with something like longing before hurrying away. Their power over Ruby had shattered like ice in spring thaw. She turned back to Kevin's embrace, feeling his heart beat strong and steady against her cheek. They had won their freedom with truth, and whatever came next, they would face it together. Judge Harrison's weathered hands smoothed across the surface of his desk, his eyes fixed on Uncle Horace with stern intensity. The courthouse had fallen silent, waiting. "Mr. Mayfield," the judge said, his voice carrying to every corner of the room, "you claimed guardianship over your niece. Present your proof." Uncle Horace's face flushed dark red. He fumbled in his coat pocket, pulling out a folded paper that had seen better days. "Right here, Your Honor. Signed and witnessed proper." The judge held out his hand, and the bailiff carried the document forward. Afternoon sunlight streamed through the high windows as Judge Harrison adjusted his spectacles, examining every line with careful scrutiny. His frown deepened. "This document," he said slowly, "bears a county seal from 1872. He looked up, steel in his gaze. "Yet the paper itself is clearly new stock. I recognize the watermark. The mill only began producing this grade last spring." A wave of whispers swept through the courthouse. Ruby's heart thundered in her chest as she watched her uncle's face drain of color. Kevin stood straighter in his chains, hope kindling in his eyes. "Furthermore," the judge continued, "the signature of witness appears to be that of Thomas Green, who passed away in 1871. He set the paper down with deliberate care. Would you care to explain these discrepancies, Mr. Mayfield?" Uncle Horace's mouth worked, but no words came out. His hands clenched and unclenched at his sides as sweat beaded on his forehead. That is," he stammered. "There must be some mistake." "The only mistake," Judge Harrison said firmly, "was in thinking this court would accept forged documents as evidence." He turned to the bailiff. "Please take Mr. Mayfield into custody for attempted fraud." Ruby watched as her uncle was led away, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Years of his control over her life crumbled in mere moments. She felt lighter, as if heavy chains had fallen from her own shoulders. The judge turned his attention to the preacher, who sat rigid in his chair, unable to meet anyone's eyes. "Reverend Wainwright, while the matter of your personal indiscretions falls outside this court's immediate jurisdiction, I cannot ignore the gravity of Naya's testimony." "Your Honor," Wainwright began, but the judge held up his hand. "You have used your position to spread false witness against these good people while concealing your own sins. I will be speaking with your church elders about your fitness for ministry." The preacher seemed to shrink in his chair. His usual commanding presence withered under the weight of exposed truth. Several of his staunchest supporters in the gallery shifted uncomfortably, unable to look at him or at Naya, who stood tall with little Fox in her arms. Judge Harrison straightened in his chair, authority ringing in his voice. Having heard all testimony and examined all evidence, this court finds as follows. He looked directly at Ruby. Miss Ruby Mayfield is hereby declared legally independent of any guardianship claims. Her marriage to Kevin Boone is recognized as lawful and binding. Joy burst in Ruby's heart like sunshine through storm clouds. She pressed her hands to her mouth to hold back a cry of happiness. Furthermore, the judge continued, all charges against Kevin Boone are dismissed. He nodded to the bailiff. Remove those chains. The sound of iron cuffs falling away echoed through the hushed courtroom. Kevin stumbled slightly as his hands came free, weeks of confinement showing in his unsteady steps. But his eyes never left Ruby's face as he crossed the space between them. They came together like two halves of a whole finally reunited. Kevin's arms wrapped around Ruby, lifting her off her feet as she buried her face in his shoulder. His beard was rough against her cheek, his familiar scent of pine and leather bringing tears to her eyes. I knew, she whispered. I knew God wouldn't let them part us. A surprising sound filled the courthouse, applause. Ruby looked up to see faces that had once sneered, now showing respect and even admiration. The town matrons who had gossiped about her size now dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs. Men who had laughed at Kevin's defense of her now nodded in approval. Court is adjourned, Judge Harrison declared, but his usual gruffness held a note of satisfaction. Kevin took Ruby's hand, his grip warm and sure, and together they walked out of the courthouse. Their heads were held high, their steps matched, as if they had never been parted. The afternoon sun painted the snow-covered street in shades of gold and rose. Shadow and Kevin's wagon waited where Ruby had left them. Kevin helped her up onto the seat, his touch lingering on her waist, before climbing up beside her. The reins felt right in his hands as he clucked to the horse. They rode in comfortable silence through town, past the shops closing for the day and homes lighting their evening lamps. The cold air held a sharp edge, but Ruby hardly felt it, warmed by Kevin's presence at her side and the joy in her heart. As they cleared the town limits and started the climb toward their mountain home, Ruby leaned against Kevin's shoulder. The steady rhythm of the wagon wheels and Shadow's hooves made a peaceful music beneath their silence. I never lost faith, Ruby whispered at last. Even in my uncle's locked room, I knew you'd find a way back to me. Kevin's arm tightened around her shoulders. He pressed a tender kiss to her forehead, his beard tickling her skin. It was you who found the way, Ruby. Your courage saved us both. The wagon rolled on through the gathering dusk, carrying them home to their little line shack in the mountains. Ahead, the peaks stood outlined against the sunset sky, permanent as God's promises, beautiful as answered prayers. Ruby slipped her hand into Kevin's free one, feeling the strength of his calloused fingers twine with hers. Together, they had faced down lies with truth, hatred with love, and shame with dignity. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would meet them the same way, side by side, their faith in each other as steady as the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. The mountain air held a crisp sweetness as Kevin and Ruby settled back into their line shack. Ruby hummed softly while kneading dough at the rough-hewn table, her fingers working with practiced care. The familiar thunk of Kevin's axe outside made a steady rhythm that matched the beating of her grateful heart. A wagon's creak drew their attention. The Hendersons from the valley below pulled up, their faces bright with genuine warmth. More neighbors followed, the Wilsons with a basket of red winter apples, Martha Tucker carrying a bolt of blue calico cloth wrapped in brown paper. We wanted to welcome you proper, Martha said, pressing the fabric into Ruby's hands. Every bride needs something new. Ruby's cheeks flushed pink at the kindness in their faces, so different from the sneers she'd known before. Her fingers traced the cloth's soft weave as tears pricked her eyes. Kevin stood tall beside her in the doorway, his arm steady around her waist. Much obliged, he said, his deep voice carrying pride. Let me introduce my wife proper. The word wife rang with certainty, with belonging. After the neighbors departed, twilight settled over the mountains like a purple shawl. Ruby set the rising bread near the hearth, while Kevin built up the fire. The flames cast dancing shadows on the walls of their small home. Kevin drew Ruby close, his eyes tender in the firelight. I'd do anything for one night with you, he whispered, echoing those desperate words from weeks ago. Ruby's laugh bubbled up, joyful and free. "And now we have a lifetime," she answered, her heart overflowing with love. They knelt together by the fireside, hands clasped in prayer. Outside, snow drifted down in gentle swirls, each flake a blessing on their mountain home. The lamp's flame wavered as Kevin reached to extinguish it, leaving only the hearth's warm glow to illuminate their happiness. Morning sunlight streamed through the patched window as Ruby opened her worn Bible across their small table. Kevin settled beside her, his weathered finger tracing beneath the words as Ruby guided him through the verses. His brow furrowed in concentration, but pride flickered in his eyes when he spelled out a difficult word correctly. "That's right," Ruby encouraged, her hand gentle on his shoulder. "You're learning fast." Later, they stood behind the cabin, where Kevin had set up empty tin cans on a fallen log. He showed Ruby how to hold his old revolver, his large hands steadying her smaller ones. "Breathe slow," he instructed. "Squeeze, don't pull." The shot rang out, missing the can but closer than before. Ruby's determined smile matched Kevin's patient nod. They practiced until her arms tired, sharing quiet laughter at her wild shots and celebrating when she finally struck her target. Near the cabin's south wall, Ruby tended the small herb patch she'd started, already sprouting tiny green shoots through the melting snow. Her fingers worked the cold earth as she spoke of summer vegetables and flowers to come. Kevin listened while mending the corral, hammering fresh rails into place. "Reckon we could keep 2 goats here," he said, measuring the space. "Give us milk and cheese come winter." Ruby looked up, cheeks glowing. "And maybe someday we could hold Sunday gatherings, share hymns with neighbors." "And children?" Kevin's voice held, gentle hope. "Yes," Ruby whispered. "Children." As dusk painted the sky purple, they rode to Naya's riverside cabin. The native woman met them at her door, dark eyes warm with welcome. Ruby clasped her hands firmly. "You gave me courage when I needed it most," Ruby said. "I won't let folks shun you anymore. You're family now." Naya's smile deepened, years of loneliness lifting from her face. Kevin nodded respectfully, acknowledging the bond between the women. Riding home beneath a canopy of stars, Ruby leaned against Kevin's shoulder. The mountain air carried the scent of pine and promise. Their horses' hooves marked a steady rhythm on the trail, like a heartbeat of renewed community and hope. The mountain frost retreated day by day, revealing patches of tender grass beneath. Inside the line shack, warmth and comfort had replaced the bitter cold of that first desperate night. Ruby's carefully stitched quilt, a masterpiece of salvaged fabrics, hung proudly by the window, adding both beauty and warmth to their home. Clay pots lined the windowsills, sprouting fresh herbs that filled the air with promise. Tiny shoots of thyme and sage reached toward the strengthening spring sun, while mint leaves unfurled in their terracotta homes. Ruby tended them like precious treasures, already planning the dried bundles that would flavor their winter meals. The sound of her clear voice lifted through the cabin as she worked dough against the wooden table, her strong arms kneading with practiced confidence. Flour dusted her apron, and her cheeks glowed with health and contentment. No longer did she hunch her shoulders or try to make herself smaller. She moved with the grace of a woman who knew her worth. Outside, Kevin ran a whetstone along his axe blade, the rhythmic scraping punctuated by his quiet humming. Between strokes, he studied the patch of ground he had marked out for their garden, mentally plotting rows of corn and beans. His eyes crinkled with pleasure when he glanced toward the cabin, catching the sound of Ruby's singing. As evening approached, wagons and riders appeared along the mountain trail. Neighbors, once suspicious, now arrived bearing covered dishes and warm greetings. The Adams family brought fresh churned butter, while the Wilsons shared early spring onions from their cold frame. Even Naya came, her dark eyes twinkling as she presented a basket of pine needle tea. The cabin filled with the warmth of bodies and the aroma of shared food. Lantern light danced across faces as Ruby led them in grace, her voice strong and sure where once it had trembled. For this food, this shelter, and this cherished company, we thank you, Lord, she prayed, as heads bowed respectfully around their table. Kevin watched his wife with quiet pride. Gone was the frightened girl he had found that winter night. In her place stood a woman of substance and dignity, earning the community's respect through her unwavering faith and generous spirit. After supper, voices joined in familiar hymns. Amazing Grace floated out into the darkness, followed by sweet hour of prayer. Stories flowed between songs, tales of spring, calving, news of distant kin, and gentle laughter at shared memories. As the last wagon disappeared into the night, Kevin and Ruby settled into their chairs before the hearth. The fire had burned low, casting a gentle glow across their home, so different now from the bare shelter it had once been. Copper pots gleamed on their hooks, dried flowers hung from the rafters, and everywhere showed touches of Ruby's careful homemaking. Kevin reached for Ruby's hand, his voice soft with memory. "I'd do anything for one night with you." Ruby's eyes shimmered in the firelight as she laid her head against his chest. "And thank God, we'll have every night." The flames flickered lower, but their home glowed with something far warmer than firelight. The blessed peace of redemption, the strength of tested faith, and the enduring power of love that had transformed two lonely souls into family. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.